how in the world did he get here? How did David, in all that he had done, get to the place in writing these words where he could say, happy? Happy is the person whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. These words, and the words from Psalm 51, were probably written months after David had an experience. While all the troops were out in the front line fighting, David was left behind, or he chose to stay behind. And he was home alone, which always can get you in trouble. And it did that evening as he went out onto the balcony. And he looked across and he saw this beautiful woman. And he beckoned this woman to come through the servants to the house, to the palace. And David slept with her. And found out later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she went and told David. So David, knowing now that he impregnated the woman who was married to another man, had to fix this. So what did he do? He sent word to Joab, who was on the front lines taking care of the troops, and he said, I want you to send Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, home to me. So Uriah comes home and meets with David. And of course, David puts on his poker face knowing that he just slept with her wife, his wife, and she's pregnant. And said, how are the troops? Small talk. How are things going on the front line? Just an excuse for conversation. The real reason was to get him home, to go and sleep with his wife, Bathsheba. And that's what David said. I want you to go home tonight and rest. Be with your wife. But Uriah, being the man that he was, didn't go into the house. But he stayed outside the house and he slept outside on a mat with the others. David heard about this and called him and said, why did you do that? And he said, I will never, while the troops are out in enemy's fire, while troops are outside sleeping in tents, go in and eat and drink and be with my wife. So again, David, being the clever, smart, imaginative person, thought, I'll try again. Called Uriah back into his house, and this time they ate together. They had a feast together, and he gave him wine and more wine. And the thinking was, if I get this guy so drunk, he's going to go back home and forget this righteous thing about not sleeping with his wife and being so good to the soldiers who were out there. But it didn't work. Uriah, even though he may have had one too many, didn't go in with his wife. So David said, plan C. He writes a letter to Joab, seals it up, gives it to Uriah, and says, I want you to deliver this to Joab. So he goes back to the front line, to the battlefield. Joab opens it up, and it says, I want you to put Uriah on the very forefront where the action is taking place. And when we get him there, close to the enemy, I want you to withdraw your troops. And that's what happened. Uriah and several others were killed by the enemy. So the question is, when David wrote these words, after being responsible for taking another man's wife and impregnating her, after being responsible for the death of her husband, and living for months with this guilt, and feeling this heaviness in his life, how did he get to this place where he could write these words? I know that David and Buddha never met. Someone I just heard said, I never would have become a Christian if it wasn't for Buddha. I'm thinking, what? And I'm thinking, Jesus and Buddha probably would have been great friends. But David came to a moment in his life where his cluttered heart and his mind, racked with remorse and guilt, found stillness. Got to go get my clicker again. We've been talking about attitudes of mindfulness. We've talked about non-judgment, about a compassionate spirit. And we talked about that story of the usher coming down and sitting with the hippie. Last week we talked about patience and the cab driver who exhibited that toward a woman who was going into hospice. Third attitude is a beginner's mind. And I know that David had no idea, Zen Buddhism, it wasn't even around then. But I know that when David wrote, "Be still," it's what we're talking about here. Being still, having a beginner's mind, is simply dropping those expectations that we have, those preconceived ideas about something. For David, in the stillness over the months, dealing with the guilt and knowing that he had done something wrong, in his monkey mind, thinking, I'll never be forgiven, the rights will never be wronged, I can't let this stuff go, I will go to my deathbed, wasting away. And that's why when you read that passage, it talks about, my bones grew heavy day after day. Guilt has a way of doing that. Stress in your life has a way of wreaking havoc with you physically and mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And David got to that point. He found that stillness in his life when he recognized, I need to get rid of those thoughts. I need to have that beginner's mind. It's about seeing things with an open mind, with fresh eyes, just like a beginner. There was a professor from Loyola University in Chicago who did a series of experiments showing that self-perceptions of expertise increase closed-minded cognition. In other words, science says those who think they're experts are more likely to be closed-minded. I watched this great TED Talk this week by Sir Kenneth Robinson, who was talking about education, how it stifles creativity. And again, it's like the experts. You fill your head with all these thoughts. I know this is how it's supposed to be. The attitude here of mindfulness is taking a breath, being aware of the moment, and saying, I don't know. I'm not an expert. What was it that Jesus said to the disciples, to the crowds? That you will not inherit the kingdom of God until you become like a child. And if anyone has a beginner's mind, it's a child who is curious about things, who wonderment is just filled with them. They're just not afraid to do things, ask questions. They're just so free. I smile at my 2-year-old. She woke up Grandma when she went to visit this week at 6:15 in the morning. My wife doesn't usually get up that morning. Heard this little knock on the door. She said, Lala, can we play? At 6:15 in the morning? Well, at 6:20 they were playing with dinosaurs. It's that childlike spirit which captivates us. It's that beginner's mind that we're talking about. To have a beginner's mind is to have that clean slate, to have that pure conscience, to know that something has happened. There was a student who was looking for that wisdom and sought out a Zen Buddhist master. And he said, I want you to teach me. So the teacher started talking to the student about meditation and other things having to do with mindfulness and being present. And all of a sudden, the student stopped and interrupted and said, oh, I already know that. At that point, I'm sure the teacher took a deep breath and smiled and said, let's go have tea together. So while they were waiting to have tea together, they talked. And then the teacher started to pour the tea when it was ready into the cup. The cup was full, and all of a sudden the tea started to overflow onto the table. And of course, the student quickly said, stop, you can't pour tea into a full cup. The teacher said, return to me when your cup is empty. It's that sense of listening, saying, I don't know, of not having to be right. How did David get to that place of being happy? Of having a clean slate? He said, I'm sorry. There was a duke who visited a galley ship and went down below where all of the criminals were manning the oars in the ship. And the duke asked them, he said, why are you here? Almost every man there claimed that they were innocent, blaming someone else or accusing the judge of taking a bribe. But there was one young man that said, sir, I deserve to be here. I stole some money. It's no one's fault but mine. I'm guilty. Upon hearing this, the duke shouted, you scoundrel! What are you doing here with all these innocent men? Get out of this company at once. So the duke ordered the prisoner to be released. He was set free while everyone else was there tugging on the oars. The key to the prisoner's freedom? He admitted his guilt. David found that place where he finally admitted his sin, where he stopped hiding his guilt, where he confessed. The cup is empty. Now I can receive grace and forgiveness and healing. And suddenly for David, after months and months, the pressure was gone. The guilt was resolved. The slate was clean. But make no mistake about it. David, the rest of his life, suffered the consequences for those actions. You don't kill somebody and then all is well. But for David, it was in those moments where he took that breath and he realized that I made a horrible mistake. And while God forgives me, I must forgive myself. It didn't change some of the other things that happened as a result in his family afterwards with his son Absalom, and the reason why Absalom hunted down his own father. It's like there are consequences. And the point is not to talk about forgiveness. Louise did a wonderful job in her workshops on talking about forgiveness and letting things go. The point is for you and for me to come to the place where we have that attitude of a child, where we come to God in faith and hope and trust and know that God will, because God is faithful. And God will wash it clean, because God is fair. And God will forget, because God is compassionate and kind. And yes, you do get a second chance, and a third chance, and a fourth chance, and on it goes. Because we're human beings, we make mistakes. The slate is clean because of the kind of God that we worship, because of the kind of God we believe in. Today, this moment, I stop and I become aware. I breathe deeply and I remember that just as a child, that I am loved, that I am free, that I am forgiven, that the slate is clean. May it be for all of us that we understand how good our God is. Amen.